Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we are going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be doing a big video on the topic of what is genocide. Now, genocide has been called the crime of all crimes. It is often conceived of as the worst thing that one could do. Those that have perpetrated it are held up as history's greatest villains. The simple definition offered by the United Nations is that genocide is the denial of the right of existence of entire human groups. However, this leaves many questions about genocide unanswered. What groups count? Is genocide a worse crime than others? If so, why? What is a crime against humanity? Is genocide such a crime? And is genocide worse than other crimes against humanity? Most controversially, what acts in history and modern times actually constitute genocide? This is a controversial topic, and I doubt that this video will be monetized, and I expect I'll lose some subscribers because of it. I do encourage you to watch all the way to the end, though, before commenting. With this video, we will be deviating from our normal form, digging into much greater depth on a single topic in a longer form video, attempting to answer these many questions and more. Let us know in the comments if you like this style and would be interested in the channel pivoting to producing fewer, longer videos like it. With that, let's dig in. What is genocide? We'll start off with some history. So, the history of genocide starts in many ways with Raphael Lemkin. So, the first person to use the word genocide was Raphael Lemkin in his 1944 work, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. Lemkin took the word from the Greek genos, meaning tribe or race, and the Latin cide, meaning killing. Lemkin was born in 1900 and raised in a Polish-Jewish family. As a young man, he was deeply concerned by the Armenian genocide that happened during World War I, especially the doctrine that country leaders could only be tried for crimes by their own countries. Lemkin fled Warsaw to Stockholm and later to the United States during World War II, losing much of his family in the Holocaust. After the war, he spoke out in support of what became the Genocide Convention and pushed individual governments to outlaw genocide. Now, Lemkin's definition of genocide was the destruction of a nation or of an ethnic group. Note that nation here is in the sense of a particular culture, not in the sense of a country or a state. Check out our video on nations versus countries for more on that. For Lemkin, the harm was in the intentional destruction of a culture. This means that genocide did not need to involve any actually killing of humans, but could include forced assimilation, forced sterilization, forced migration or dispersal of a community. It should also be noted that random mass killings don't constitute a genocide under Lemkin's view either, as the true harm was the destruction of a culture. Now, of key importance for Lemkin is that genocide is a crime not just the people who were wronged, but a crime against the entirety of humanity, because it reduces the diversity of cultures in the world, depriving others of being able to experience, learn from, and benefit from those cultures. For Lemkin, this diversity of cultural practices is a good in itself, and intentional destruction of cultures is a real harm. And therefore, genocide is harmful not simply to the people that it actually harms, but to everyone in the world, because we lose that benefit of cultural diversity. Now, Lemkin was writing just after the Holocaust, when the world was trying to come to terms with the atrocities committed during World War II, and what institutions could be created to ensure that they never happened again. World War II was, and continues to be, one of, if not the deadliest war in human history. At the time, the world was both shocked by the horror of the war and the challenges with prosecuting or defining crimes of this magnitude. While Lemkin wrote before the Nuremberg trials, no one there was charged with genocide, only crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace, as genocide would not be codified until 1948, after the conclusion of the trial. A quick side note, Lemkin made an important distinction between the murder of a culture and the natural death of one. For Lemkin, while the natural death of a culture should be mourned, just like the death of a person, it was not a crime. A culture might die a natural death simply because the people choose to assimilate into a different culture. They choose to stop or cease traditional practices or stop learning a particular language. But if it wasn't done intentionally, then it wasn't a crime, though it should still be mourned. The crime of genocide requires intent. One might imagine similar parallels to manslaughter, perhaps unintended destruction of a culture caused by reckless but not malicious acts, being somewhere in between on a moral scale, not as bad as genocide, but still immoral. And this question of intent and the guilty mind when it comes to genocide is going to be a key point when we look at a list of historical genocides in deciding whether or not they should actually count as a genocide or simply the destruction of a culture and a people. Now, let's talk about the political and legal balancing weights that were done as the UN began to arrive at a genocide convention. So, Lemkin proposed an international convention on genocide to the United Nations with the hope of getting an international law that could be used to hold those who perpetrated genocide to account. Remember, Lemkin was deeply concerned that the governments in the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide could only be held to account by their own governments. He wanted there to be international laws that could hold these people to account. His proposal included a provision for cultural genocide that didn't actually involve any killing. However, the political process of the United Nations led to the definition being somewhat weakened. While cultural genocide is implied, it's not actually explicitly stated. That said, the UN's definition of genocide has endured and been used in the international tribunals on Rwanda as well as Yugoslavia. So let's take a look at that definition right now. According to the Genocide Convention, genocide is defined as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. According to the UN, there are 5 different types of genocide. Type number 1, killing members of the group. The first of these types listed in the UN Convention is the most obvious and least controversial. If you kill people for the purpose of destroying their ethnic, religious, or racial group, you are committing genocide. The second type, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, should have a clear connection to the first. If you are intentionally causing serious bodily or mental harm to a particular group of people, perhaps through repeated attacks, targeted sexual violence, dehumanization campaigns that drive others to harm individuals in that group, etc., you are guilty of genocide. Even if you are not trying to kill them, you are trying to cause them serious bodily or mental harm, you are guilty of genocide. Number 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calibrated to bring about its physical destruction in part or in whole, or in part. Here's where the definition starts to get into non-specific political compromise to a certain degree. However, a common sense reading of this might include things like mass starvation, forced deportation, destruction of homes and community buildings, deprivation of other service with the goal of driving a community out and destroying it. And so if a particular government takes away all of the public services from a region or area that has a minority ethnic group that they're trying to get rid of, that might constitute genocide, even if they don't go in and kill any people, because they are deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. If you suddenly stop providing any clean drinking water to all of the people of a certain ethnic group in your country, that can count as genocide. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Even if someone is not destroying a culture currently, they may be attempting to destroy it in the future by preventing people from having children, imposing forced sterilization, or using rape as a weapon of war, etc. And last but not least, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This type helps move towards the idea of cultural genocide. Taking children away from their parents by force and not allowing them to raise them in their culture can completely destroy a culture without killing a single person. These are the 5 types of genocide as defined by the United Nations. As noted, Lemkin's definition is a little more expansive to include anything that's a purposeful killing of a culture. But these 5 definitions that are quite specific do get very close to that point. Let's take a look at intent versus knowledge. So some definitions of genocide require a clear intent on the part of the perpetrator to cause the destruction of a group. Others take a lower bar, since intent is hard to prove, arguing that the only thing that needs to be shown is that the perpetrator knew that their actions contributed to a campaign with genocide as its goal. Setting aside my skeptical concerns that knowledge may not even be possible, you might want to eliminate a group under this definition, but if you knew that your actions contributed to a campaign to eliminate that group, you might still be liable. For example, the engineer that builds the gas chambers may not want to kill the particular group that those gas chambers are being used to exterminate. But if they act with full knowledge of the purpose of those gas chambers, under this knowledge definition, they're still responsible, even if they had no intent. However, it's harder to show either knowledge or intent for the lower levels you get. Certainly, the engineer that designed the gas chambers might be assumed to have knowledge of their use, but the individual bricklayers that are building them, they might not know what was going on. And so the further down the chain of power and command you get, the harder it is to even prove a knowledge case of this, much less an intent case. This means that practically only high-ranking officials are often prosecuted, but morally, depending on your definition, those who had either intent or knowledge further down the ladder may still be guilty, even if it cannot be proven. If taking the action was to further the goal of exterminating an entire group of people, you might be guilty of genocide, even if no one can ever prove it because you didn't make public statements out there that people can cite and say, oh, you clearly intended this. Whereas for the high-ranking officials, those public statements are often much more accessible, and so proving the intent is easier. Next, let's take a look at following orders. So a common defense for those accused of genocide is that they were just following orders, or that they were acting in their official capacity as the head of a state and therefore immune from prosecution. This is exactly the concern that Lemkin had, that heads of state couldn't be prosecuted. The unique feature of genocide and other crimes against humanity is that these are impermissible defenses. Even heads of state and people just following orders can and should be prosecuted for genocide, at least according to Lemkin and the United Nations. Next, let's move on to a couple of the kind of metaphysical questions about genocide. First off, let's look at the question, what kind of group? Now, the most obvious group that genocide should apply to is race or ethnicity. While few object to the inclusion of this grouping in a classification of genocide, there are questions whether there is any objective category called race. Check out our video on the philosophy of race or the work of Anthony Oppia for more. Or if race is instead socially constructed. However, even if race is a socially constructed feature of our lives, that doesn't mean that it cannot be used as a category for genocide. This is because if the perpetrators can use whatever categorization they're using, including race, to identify members of the group through whatever social conventions are normally used to identify race in order to discriminate against them, they can attempt to eliminate that group. Remember, genocide is the attempted elimination of a culture, and cultures seem to be one of the most socially constructed things we have. And so simply because race is socially constructed, or if race is socially constructed, that doesn't mean that you couldn't commit a genocide against a race, because it being socially constructed doesn't prevent perpetrators from genocide from identifying people of that race, nor does it prevent people of that race from having a unique culture or identity. In fact, someone might be a victim of genocide even if they're not actually a member of the group that's being targeted, simply because they're mistaken for a member of that group. One might think of Islamophobic violence perpetrated against Sikhs, who are often misidentified as being Muslim. The next group that is commonly identified with genocide is people who are attacked for their religion. On the one hand, it might seem like religion would be the next obvious inclusion of a type of group that genocide can be committed against, and it is included in the UN's formal definition. However, there is something worrying here, because if we step back and try to come up with a reason to include particular groups and exclude others, we might think that the reason we should include groups in a definition of genocide is because there is something innate about being born into a particular group, and we shouldn't be killing people based on something that they were born into. You might think that it's justifiable to kill people for the acts that they've done in their life, but it seems morally impermissible to kill them for something they had no control over, particularly just simply the way they were born. However, there is something worrying here. We might think the principle of inclusion or exclusion of the categories would be that they are innate and immutable. Someone is attacking you for something that you were born with that you cannot change. Religion falls into neither of these categories. People can and do change their religion, and no one is born with a particular religion. And so if we include religion into this category, we allow this to say it's not just about things you are born with or that you innately have. It also raises the questions about our ability to get kids out of abusive cults, for example. If there's a cult that believes in systematic and pervasive child abuse, where children are regularly sexually violated at an early age, and are told that this is just part of their religion and belief system, should we take those children away from that cult? The fifth type of genocide says that removing kids from a religious community is a type of genocide, with the purpose of destroying that community. But it would seem, on balance, that such an action would be morally justified in this case, despite in some ways fitting the definition of genocide. Maybe it would not count, since the intent of removing the children from that cult is not to destroy the cult, even though we may want to do that, but rather it's to protect the children. Not to dismantle the religion, though that would be the known impact. So if you follow the knowledge version that we discussed earlier, this wouldn't be a valid escape. It raises some interesting questions about, depending on which groups we count, what things could be included in genocide that we might actually think maybe they're not really genocide. But part of the problem may be that this underlying question of maybe there are some groups that we should destroy is the problem genocide is trying to address. It's the idea that just because you think a group is really problematic, trying to destroy it has really bad moral consequences, namely genocide. Now, in Lemkin's original definition, political groups were included as a group that would be eligible for having genocide committed against them. However, this didn't make it into the final UN convention, in part because some of the parties, especially supposedly the Soviet Union, couldn't get behind this for fear that they could be prosecuted for persecuting opposing political parties. Now, philosophically, there might be a reason to include them. If we're allowing religion, which is also neither immutable nor innate, politics would make sense as well. People are often driven to violence against members of opposing political parties, and the parties in power work hard to reduce the power of their political opponents. And in fact, genocides are often committed against ethnic groups because those ethnic groups support different politicians than the ethnic groups that are committing the genocide against them. And so committing genocide against an individual political group in some countries is the logical conclusion of a tactic of trying to gain political power. And so we might want to protect these political groups as a class. In many countries, political groups and ethnicity do coincide, but in some countries they don't. And simply because they don't coincide, it doesn't seem to mean that these groups shouldn't be protected in some way. The next question, how big of a group should we be thinking about here? Complete and total annihilation of an ethnic group or religion would be challenging to accomplish, and even the most horrifying genocides have failed to accomplish such an atrocity. In many cases, they have not even attempted it. Does this mean that no real genocides have happened? Not necessarily. The UN definition cites the extermination of a group in whole or in part. This means that if you're trying to get rid of all of the people of a particular ethnic group in a particular area, all the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, for example, all of the Jews in Poland, all of the Muslims in India, this would still count. So all you have to be doing is focusing on a particular group in a particular area. And you don't even have to accomplish it, but still have the intent to try. Now, this raises the question in the opposite direction. How small of a group would count as a genocide? We clearly want to distinguish genocide from murder, but what is the smallest group of people you could try to eliminate for something to be considered genocide? One way of thinking through this is to ask, what would the smallest number of people that would lead to the destruction of a culture in a particular area be? Since, at least for Lemkin, the key feature of genocide is that it seeks to destroy a culture. Some have argued that the systematic killing of all the leaders of a community could constitute a genocide, even if it was a numerically small number of people or a small portion of the population, since doing so might endanger the culture itself. Killing, if there are within a community traditional storytellers that keep the cultural history, killing all of them might constitute a genocide under Lemkin's definition, even if it was only a handful of people that were actually killed, because doing so might have the impact of destroying the culture. Now, generally, the larger the geographic area covered by an attempted cultural destruction, the more likely it is to qualify as a genocide. If it's only one town, some might be reticent to call it a genocide. But part of a country would make this classification more likely, while anything at the country level or above would almost certainly meet the standard of genocide. And some of this scales with the size of the ethnic group. It's not necessarily just the geographical scope of the killing, but also the geographical scope of the overall group. And even so, trying to exterminate an entire town could still qualify. Now, one might wonder why the international community doesn't simply establish a line above which something is considered genocide, number of people, land area covered, etc. The clear reason would be that this would create incentives for governments that wish to destroy a culture to simply kill a number of people that's just below that line. Similarly, establishing criteria based on the viability of a society afterward, i.e. something is considered large enough to be a genocide if the community is not viable afterward, disincentivize members of the impacted community from stepping up and bringing their people together in the time when they need it the most. Communities should not be punished for being resilient in the face of adversity. This makes a specific line on genocide very difficult to draw. The next question, or the last question within this scope, is the question of, can genocide happen without killing? So for Lemkin, genocide was the act of killing a culture, not individual people. While it did often include the killing of people, that wasn't an essential component of it. The harm that made genocide evil in Lemkin's mind was that it killed an entire culture, something that would be impermissible even if no humans were killed in doing it. For the United Nations, explicitly calling out cultural genocide was too far, but the convention does include some things that don't require killing. The taking of children is a clear example of this. Less clear, but still impactful, is the inclusion of criteria like creating the conditions that would lead to the destruction of a culture as a type of genocide. One might imagine that the complete destruction of homes, places of business, places of worship, etc., shutting off food supplies to a country, shutting off water supplies or electricity to a country, could fall under this category, but it's drawn sufficiently broadly to make it hard to determine what exactly is prohibited. Politically feasible, but legally harder to enforce. For philosophers, though, the real question is not what Lemkin or the UN said, but what should be the case. This seems to ride on some of the ethical questions that will be covered in the next section. Who is harmed by genocide? Is it just the victims? Or is there something more abstract, like a culture that can experience harm? If it's just the victims, then it seems like we need to show that some harm is actually being done to the victims. If there's something more abstract, like a culture that can experience harm, then it seems that even if there's no individuals that are being harmed, there could still be a collective culture that's being harmed. If so, the case for genocide without killing is much stronger, since something other than individual humans can be harmed. And that's what we're going to look at next. This brings us to part 3, ethics. So, the first question we have here is, who is harmed by a genocide? Now, the most obvious answer to this question is that the victims are harmed by genocide. But the deeper question here is whether victims of genocide are harmed more than they would have been by a comparable non-genocidal crime. We are trying to make the case not simply that genocide is a crime, but rather that it is a crime of all crimes, that it is in some way more evil than a simple murder. Is someone harmed more because they were killed in a car crash or part of a genocide? Some have made the case that victims of genocide are harmed more because someone who is killed in a car accident might expect their works, their projects, their families, their children to continue on after them. But someone that is killed in a genocide loses both their life and their legacy, since their family and their community, their works and their projects are often killed as well. And so, in some way, being a victim of a genocide is experiencing more harm than someone that is simply killed with a normal murder or through an accident. Another group that might be harmed more than in just a normal killing is members of the group that survive. If you hear that a member of your particular religious denomination is killed in a car accident, you might be sad. But if you hear that someone is out there targeting members of your religious denomination and has killed someone already, you'd be probably a little bit more scared. You'd be less likely to actively participate in events for your community, to show proudly that you're a member of that community, and more. Even if you never are directly impacted, the culture of fear that a genocide causes could have significant impact on you and your life. This is that creating the conditions to which a culture could be destroyed or that are intolerable for life. And that's how, in some ways, survivors are harmed. Now, one might say that a series of murders that was targeting a group of people in a small town might have the same kind of an impact, but also we in some way do think that serial killers and people that are killing randomly from a community are doing something that's a greater sense of harm than a murder. But perhaps not at the level of a genocide, in part because of the other groups that are impacted beyond just the victims and survivors. So, moving on from individuals, you might think that the group itself could be harmed by a genocide. This pushes against the classically liberal idea that only individuals have rights. See our video on what is liberalism for more on that. But for those that do think that groups have rights and can be harmed, it should be clear that the attempted extermination of an entire group would harm that group more than simply random deaths in a population. If you think that entire groups have rights, then you probably think that a genocide is doing harm to them. Now, Lemkin originally made the case that genocide was a crime against humanity, because destroying a culture was depriving humanity of the richness and diversity of the other ways of living and perspectives. Lemkin assumes that this diversity is inherently a good thing for humanity, and its intentional destruction, therefore, an evil. We could imagine several arguments in support of this claim. One might argue, similar to John Stuart Mill's argument for free speech, that the more perspectives and cultures we have, the more chance we have of finding the ones that are right or the most conducive to happiness. The cosmopolitan might argue that more cultures give people more choice in what they can take and sample from to make their lives fulfilling. One only need to look at the history of art and music to see the benefits that arise when different aesthetic traditions are mixed together to create new art forms. By destroying the diversity of cultures that exist in the world, we are losing the opportunity to gain those new art forms, and therefore humanity loses something. Even the people who don't even know that the genocide happened lose out because they never get the opportunity to engage or learn about that culture. Now, one last group that might be surprising to be listed here is the perpetrators of the genocide. In line with the Ubuntu philosophy of justice, we might argue that the perpetrators of a genocide are also uniquely harmed by committing and supporting genocide. Check out our video on Ubuntu philosophy for more. Ubuntu philosophy argues that the oppressors are as harmed by committing gross acts of oppression because they lose some part of their humanity in doing so. When you commit genocide, you lose some of what makes you human. Ubuntu philosophy also prescribes a way to prevent genocide from devolving into cycles of hatred, which we are going to see in some of the instances of genocide when we get to them, where the victim of the last genocide commits a genocide against their former oppressors or against another group that is now out of power. By acknowledging the harm that is done both to the victims but also to the perpetrators of a genocide, we can attempt to break this cycle and try to prevent future cycles of genocide from occurring. Next, we have an important question Is genocide worse than other crimes? We'll take a look at the no perspective first. So some have argued that genocide is not importantly distinct from other crimes. Certainly killing more people is worse than killing fewer, but when the same number of people die, a genocide versus another war crime, perhaps the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians not focused on a particular ethnic group, some philosophers have argued that there is no important ethical difference. Both are certainly war crimes, both are violations of international law, and both are morally abhorrent. Many crimes against humanity have similar features to genocide and so should not be distinguished. There's no hierarchy of crimes against humanity in international law, so there should not be any consideration that genocide is in some way worse. Some philosophers make the case that genocide is simply afforded this special status only out of reverence for the Holocaust, a distinction which is sentimental but not rationally justified. Now, on the other side, others have argued that genocide should be considered the crime of all crimes, the apex of the pyramid, something that is not just distinguished by the scope of the crime, how many people were killed, but by the very nature of it, that it is qualitatively of a different level than other crimes. Some have justified this distinction by arguing that the harms caused by genocide, to groups and to humanity, are worse than other war crimes, which may harm civilians but do not eradicate cultures. Others have made the case that genocide should be separate because countries often try to justify other war crimes by appeal to other goals of national security, etc., but there's no excuse for genocide. There's a moral coding to that label that people still get concerned with, even when they may not be concerned about other more common war crimes. Nothing can justify genocide, and therefore it is the crime of all crimes. Finally, in this section, let's look at some adjacent atrocities. So, first off, war crimes. Now, just war theory attempts to outline the situations in which a war can be just or moral. While many types of just war theory are related to genocide, the most salient is jus in bello, the theory of how to be just while engaging in a war. Specifically, this looks at what would be considered a war crime. In international law, there are 3 ways to commit a war crime. A warring party cannot target civilians or non-combatants directly. If civilians are expected to be unintentionally harmed by an attack, the harm must be proportional to the military gain. And if civilians are expected to be unintentionally harmed by the attack, the least harmful methods should be chosen. It should be clear that this definition is insufficient to include all versions of genocide, as a country might claim that the extermination of an entire population is required for greater goals of national unity. And as noted, and that they're going to do it through the most humane means possible of quiet, silent deaths through a gas chamber. And as noted, there can be genocide without killing. So while genocide can be a war crime, it is not always a war crime under traditional jus in bello theory. Check out our video on the philosophy of war for more on that. Now, it's not clear or consistent what people would define as crimes against humanity. However, we might extrapolate a definition based on Lemkin's justification for the harm of genocide. Genocide, according to Lemkin, is particularly harmful because it hurts all of humanity by depriving the world of a culture. We might think then that a crime against humanity is one that is something which harms everyone or harms humanity as a whole. This is what makes crimes against humanity able to be prosecuted outside of the traditional legal structures, because everyone is harmed by them, and therefore other countries can and should be able to prosecute each other in an international court, because those other countries, despite not being party to the crime, are still harmed by it. Now, slavery might be considered an example of a crime against humanity that is not genocide. Slavery doesn't attempt to exterminate a population or group, but rather to subjugate it completely, something that is nearly, if not equally, as heinous. We are all hurt by such a practice existing in society, as it means that things you buy and use may be created by slaves, and by supporting such a system, you are, a la Ubuntu philosophy, losing some of your humanity. But I think there could be a case that many types of slavery, at least, do not count as genocide, though they still count as horrible crimes against humanity, because the purpose of slavery is actively to keep a culture alive, merely completely subservient and downtrodden to another culture, whereas the purpose of genocide is to completely eliminate a particular culture. With that, we're moving on to Part 4, Historic and Modern Genocides. Genocide existed in the world long before the word was coined, and it has unfortunately continued long after as well. We cannot list every genocide that has occurred throughout history, nor can we provide a complete accounting of any of these atrocities, as there have been far too many. But we are going to, in this final section, touch on 20 in different regions around the world throughout different parts of history. It should be noted that many of these narratives and numbers are disputed by most, if not all, of the countries that are involved, both because of the challenges of documenting the extent of these kinds of atrocities, particularly very far in the past, but also because of the political interests in covering them up. If genocide is the crime of all crimes, there is a strong incentive for countries to cover up the fact that they have committed a genocide in their past. Once we have completed our tour of genocides of the world, we will finally turn to the question on the minds of many, and possibly the reason you clicked on this video, whether the current actions of Hamas and Israel constitute genocide. Let's take a look. We start in North America with the Native American genocide. While it's hard to get an exact count of the population of the Americas before contact with Europe, most scholars estimate that millions of Native Americans were killed through war, massacre, and disease. The intent here was made clear with the philosophy of manifest destiny. There are many individual acts, from initial contact up to very recently, that have been called genocide, including several documented instances of European settlers purposefully giving tobacco, handkerchiefs, and blankets from smallpox hospitals to Native Americans, the Trail of Tears that led to the forced displacement of thousands of Native Americans, even setting aside the thousands that died during the displacement. Remember that the group impacted by genocide can be an ethnic group in a specific place, and so the forced removal of a people from a place counts as a genocide. The California genocide, where thousands of Native Americans were killed and the government paid bounties for scalps and heads of Native Americans and supported policies for the purpose, the express purpose of the extermination of Native Americans. And even the forced sterilization without informed consent of many Native American women in the 1960s and 1970s, dating back to the philosophies of eugenics from the early 1900s, and unfortunately, many others. As noted, we are not going to get to all the genocides in the world, and we will not even be able to sufficiently document the ones that we cover. This is simply a brief note of them. Staying in the Americas, we have the Taino genocide. They were an ethnic group that lived on the island of Hispaniola. It is estimated that they numbered between 200,000 and 1 million people at first contact with Europeans, but over the course of just 25 years, that population was reduced to 32,000 people through starvation, disease, enslavement, and massacres. This has been called a genocide, and the severe decline of the population of an entire ethnic group between 85 and 95% makes it proportionally one of the worst genocides. Around 2/3 of European Jews were killed in the Holocaust, for example. There are questions of whether this was an intentional extermination, though, or simply the natural result of harsh enslavement and oppression this group was subjected to. Once again, bringing in that question of intent versus knowledge. If there was knowledge that this action would lead to the destruction of this group, but not the intent to destroy them, should this be counted as a genocide? Next up, Peruvian sterilization. Under the government of Alberto Fujimori, the government of Peru performed over 300,000 sterilizations targeting especially indigenous women in the 1990s, many of which were forced or provided without any understanding of what the procedure would actually entail. Scholars have contended that this constitutes type 4 genocide, as there is support for active intent among the policymakers that implemented this program to exterminate this group of people, even though people were not killed, but merely sterilized. Remember, type 4 says the prevention within a group of having children can count as a type of genocide. Next, the Selknam genocide. The Selknam people were an indigenous community of Tierra del Fuego. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, livestock companies, with the support of the Chilean and Argentine governments, began to pay bounty hunters to kill the Selknam people in an attempt to push them into areas that were not suitable for livestock, and eventually they were all deported to a much smaller island. Some scholars claim that the Selknam were reduced from 4,000 people to only around 100 in just 50 years. The genocidal intent was very clear here, to remove a group of people in an area from existence. Next, the Holocaust. If genocide is the worst crime, many have argued that the Holocaust was the worst genocide. The systematic and deliberate extermination of 6 million Jewish people during World War II was so horrific that it led to the creation of the term genocide, not to mention all of the Roma people, gay people, and others that were killed. This kind of atrocity has been going on for centuries, but it was not until this moment that the world would be stepped up and acknowledged that it is a uniquely terrible crime. A full explanation of the horrors of the Holocaust, including the many non-Jewish people that were killed, will need to await another video. But to suffice it to say, if anything counts as a genocide, the Holocaust does. Next, the Bosnian Genocide. During the Bosnian War in the early 1990s, the Bosnian Serb army, led by Ratko Mladic, was found by the UN to have engaged in genocide. This included the massacre of 8,000 Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica, as well as the systematic extermination and displacement of Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats. Mladic was convicted of 10 war crimes, including genocide, extermination, and forced deportation. Aborigines Crusade. In the early 1200s, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the Cathars, a Christian group in southern France, northern Italy, and northern Spain that was denounced as heretics by the Catholic Church. This included the massacre of entire cities. The Cathar movement was eventually completely exterminated through massacre and later Inquisition. This was noted by Lemkin as a key example of a religious as opposed to ethnic genocide. Next, the Russian pogroms. When the Russian Empire acquired additional territory in Eastern Europe in the late 1800s, which had a much larger Jewish population than previously existed in Russia, and the empire restricted Jewish movement, not allowing them out of this new territory. In these areas, anti-Jewish riots arose during times of strife, such as after the assassination of the Tsar, where perpetrators would attack, kill, and murder Jewish populations simply because they were unhappy about something else. These continued for years, with another wave in the early 1900s that killed thousands of Jewish people. During the Russian Civil War, it is estimated that over 1,500 pogroms killed hundreds of thousands of Jewish people throughout this territory. The Armenian Genocide. Often the genocides of World War I are overshadowed by the atrocities of World War II, but that doesn't mean that they didn't happen. During the First World War, the Ottoman Empire began blaming their failures on the Armenian population in eastern Anatolia, who were largely Christian, which led to massacres of the Armenian population, death marches into the Syrian desert, mass deportations, forced Islamization, including selling young women and girls into sex slavery. Many estimate that over 1 million Armenians were killed and another million were deported. As in the Holocaust, there were other closely related genocides during this time, such as the Pontic Greek genocide, etc. While modern Turkey refuses to acknowledge that this was a genocide, many other countries have. Next, the Yazidi genocide. The Yazidi genocide was perpetrated by the Islamic State against the Yazidi people from 2014 to 2017 and included massacres, rape, and forced conversions to Islam. Reports estimate that thousands were killed, over 10,000 women and girls were forced to convert to Islam, and nearly 3/4 of the global Yazidi population was displaced. Next, the Dzungar genocide. The Dzungar genocide was the destruction of the Dzungar people, largely Buddhist Mongols, by the Qing dynasty in the 1700s, killing more than 500,000 people by some estimates, around 80% of the total population. This was done following the conquest of Dungzaria, which would later be renamed Xinjiang by China. The land was repopulated with Muslim Uyghurs, as well as Han Chinese, the majority group in China, and other ethnic groups. This led to the region becoming a haven for Muslims in China and presaged the Uyghur genocide hundreds of years later, which brings us to the Uyghur genocide. In 2014, the Chinese government detained over 1 million Uyghurs, where they were subjected to forced labor, religious and political indoctrination, forced sterilization, and forced abortions. Over 16,000 mosques have been destroyed in the region, and hundreds of thousands of children have been separated from their parents. The Chinese government has been accused of genocide, both for their forced transfer of children and the forced sterilization. While some have contested that this constitutes genocide due to fewer mass killings, it should be clear that under both the UN definitions and Lemkin's initial description of an attempted destruction of a culture, that most scholars of genocide would agree that it qualifies. Next up, the Nanjing Massacre. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, which started before the Second World War in 1937 but later became a part of the Second World War when Hitler allied with Japan, included many war crimes, some of which have been described as a genocide or even the Asian Holocaust. There were many atrocities during this war, and estimates of the civilian dead numbers in the millions, with estimates of the total dead from Japanese war crimes being around 6 million, similar to the magnitude of the Holocaust. Many of these crimes were targeted at ethnic Han Chinese. A particularly brutal example of this is the Nanjing or Nanking Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanjing. Exact numbers are disputed, but many sources support over 200,000 murders and tens of thousands of rapes over the course of just 6 weeks. Japanese soldiers even went so far as to compete over who could kill 100 people the fastest. Aboriginal genocide. European settlers in Australia engaged in massacres, forced removals of children from Aboriginal communities, and forced displacement of Aboriginal groups. These were especially prevalent during the Frontier Wars from the last 1700s to the early 1900s. Two especially egregious acts that have been claimed to be genocide include the Black War, where almost the entire Aboriginal population of Tasmania was destroyed, and the Queensland Aboriginal Genocide, with estimates of death tolls ranging from 24,000 to 66,000. Next, the Cambodian Genocide. The rule of the Khmer Rouge was horrific for many reasons, including genocide, but many other crimes against humanity as well. The scope of these actions is staggering, both in terms of the sheer number of people killed, around 2 million by some estimates, but also the share of the Cambodian population that was killed, around a quarter of the population in just 4 years, from 1975 to 1979. This included the killing of many ethnic and religious minorities, including hundreds of thousands of Chinese Cambodians, over 100,000 Cambodian Cham, and tens of thousands of Vietnamese Cambodians. Many of these were murdered in the killing fields with pickaxes in order to save on bullets. Next, the Rohingya Genocide. The persecution of Rohingya Muslims in majority Buddhist Myanmar has been going on for decades, but the genocide truly began in 2016. While the total numbers of dead have been comparatively small, an estimated 25,000 dead and 18,000 raped, this is in part because so many Rohingya have fled the conflict to neighboring Bangladesh, between 700,000 and 1 million, depending on the estimate. And remembering that genocide is not just about the forced killing of people, but the enacting the conditions of life that would lead to them being forced to be removed from an area, this seems certainly to qualify. Next up, the Yemeni Genocide. The civil war in Yemen since 2014 has led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, including an estimated 85,000 Yemeni children died from starvation, and 4 million people collectively have been displaced. Some scholars have accused Saudi Arabia of genocide for its use of starvation as a weapon of war and the targeting of Yemeni cultural and historical sites by the Saudis, though others have argued that this is simply a horribly horrific war and shouldn't be counted as a genocide. Last but not least, we move to Africa. The Darfur Genocide. The genocide in Darfur began when 2 rebel groups in Darfur, the western region of Sudan, attacked a military airfield in 2003 in response to marginalization of the region by the capital. The government responded by arming militia forces to eliminate the rebellion. These Janjaweed militias responded by committing a genocide against the Fur, Masalit, and Sagawa ethnic groups, killing an estimated 200,000 people in just 2 years. Janjaweed forces used rape as a weapon of war, killing all of the men and boys in communities and then raping all of the women and girls. Recently, this conflict has reemerged. In 2018, protests supported by the military ousted Omar al-Bashir, but the civilian leader of the country resigned following a coup. This has led to a civil war, which began in 2023 between the forces of the government's military and the Janjaweed militias, which have been refashioned as the Rapid Support Forces. There have been many accusations of war crimes, including genocide, by the Rapid Support Forces against the Masalit people, to name a few. Next up, Ethiopian genocides. Ethiopia has many different ethnicities, including Tigray, Amhara, Oromo, and many more, which have, when in power, engaged in ethnic cleansing and genocides against each other. This is another situation where the perpetrators of one era become the victims of the next era. In the 1970s, Tigrayan and Oromo ethno-nationalist groups claimed that the policies of the Amhara emperor privileged the Amhara groups and began attacking Amhara people. When the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, took power in the early 1990s, they undertook genocidal actions including mass killings, forced sterilization, forced marriage, abduction of children, and land annexation, in many cases with the help of the Oromo Liberation Army against the Amhara people. When the current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, who is of Oromo descent, took power in 2018, the balance of power shifted again. In 2020, the armed conflict between the Ethiopian federal government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, broke out and eventually led to the government committing a genocide against the Tigrayan people with the help of the Eritrean government. Senior members of the Ethiopian government called for wiping out all Tigrayans for 100 years. Rape and forced sexual violence was very widespread, with some soldiers claiming that they were trying to eradicate the Tigray ethnic group by giving as many women as they could HIV and impregnating the women with Oromo babies. Famine was also used as a weapon of war here, with food supplies being cut off to the region, resulting in many deaths. And last but not least, the Rwandan genocide. Rwanda represents a case of cyclical repression. During colonial times, the minority Tutsi population was in power and oppressed the Hutu majority with the help of the colonial powers. After independence, the Hutus took power, and following the assassination of President Habyarimana, who ordered the assassination, is disputed. Some claim it's the current president of Rwanda. A Tutsi ordered it. Others claim it was Hutu extremists. But following that assassination, a systematic genocide of Tutsi began, resulting in the killings of hundreds of thousands of Tutsis in just a few months. Now the Tutsi minority has returned to power and maintains oppressive control over the population. With that, we move to the final topic for this video, Palestine and Israel. First, a brief history. Before getting into this, it should be noted that most scholars think that modern Jewish people and modern Palestinians are both descendants of a common single culture, the Canaanites. While these groups diverged over time in terms of religious beliefs, cultures, etc., they were originally one people who all occupied the modern area of Israel and Palestine. So regardless of either group's claim to be the true indigenous group, claims that are complicated by people believing religious narratives or things that are written down in the Bible over science, it is most likely that they are both indigenous to the area. And while they are separate ethnic and religious groups now, they were probably closely related, and more closely related than the leaders of either group would care to acknowledge. Now, while tensions in the area of Israel can be traced back for many years, the start of modern tension is likely during the Ottoman rule, which lasted from the 1500s to the end of World War I. Jewish people experienced some discrimination under the Ottoman Empire, and sources document multiple massacres of Jews in Baghdad and Barfurish in the 1800s. In 1917, Great Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, which announced British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, and were later given the mandate over Palestine by the other European powers. To many scholars, this was the original sin that set off the conflict between Arabs and Jews in the area. After the declaration, there were riots and protests that killed dozens of both Arabs and Jews. Over the next few decades, over 100,000 Jews migrated to the territory and established a national military. When the British did not heed Palestinian Arabs' calls to halt migration, they rebelled against the British government. After more violence on both sides, the British proposed a solution that would lead to 2 separate states in 10 years. Following the Second World War, Jewish militias began attacking British government offices, police headquarters, etc. This brings us to possible instances of genocide. We'll go through them chronologically to give you a little bit of a sense of the timeline. So, first, the formation of Israel. During the Nakba, or catastrophe, Zionist forces killed over 15,000 Palestinians and violently displaced over half of the Palestinian population. At the time, around 750,000 people. Over 80% of Palestinian mosques were destroyed and large areas of land were stolen. Israel passed laws revoking the citizenship of many Palestinians and rendering them stateless. Next, the First Intifada. The First Intifada, or uprising, also known as the Stone Intifada, was a comparatively peaceful series of protests against Israeli treatment of Palestinians from 1987 to 1993. It included civil disobedience, strikes, boycotts, graffiti, barricading, throwing of Molotov cocktails, and stones at the Israeli army. Israel responded by deploying troops. By the end of the conflict, over 1,200 Palestinians had been killed, over 100,000 had been injured, and nearly 2,000 Palestinians' homes had been destroyed. Between 150 and 200 Israelis were killed in the conflict. Now, the Second Intifada followed the failure of the Camp David summit to finalize a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Palestinians protested the visit by Ariel Sharon to the Al-Aqsa compound and were met with Israeli police who fired live ammunition, rubber bullets, and tear gas. Both sides engaged in much harsher tactics than in the First Intifada, including suicide bombings on the part of Palestinians, with the final death totals being around 5,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis. Many on both sides were civilians. Next, settler practices. Israel has continued to build settlements in Palestinian territories, often through the destruction and theft of Palestinian lands and homes. Bulldozers that look more like tanks than something you would consider a bulldozer, destroying Palestinian homes where they've lived for generations. Homes continued to be stolen and bulldozed despite prohibitions from international courts, the U.S., and even the Israeli Supreme Court. Thousands of Palestinians lose their homes to Israeli settlement every year. Hamas. Hamas took power in Palestinian elections in 2006, but soon engaged in civil war with the opposition Fatah and took control of the Gaza Strip, dividing the Palestinian territories into two, Gaza and the West Bank. Hamas has advocated for the destruction of Israel. To accompany this, they've engaged in widespread rocket attacks on Israeli civilians, as well as suicide bombings. They're very clear with their intentions to destroy Israel. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a broad attack against Israeli civilians. This included a barrage of over 3,000 rockets, the killing of over 1,000 people, including around 700 civilians. Instances of rape and sexual assault have been reported, and the kidnapping of around 250 Israelis who were taken hostage in the Gaza Strip. Many have noted that this was the bloodiest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. And finally, the Gaza War. The Israeli government responded to this attack by declaring war on Hamas and invading the Gaza Strip, a war which continues today. This has included indiscriminate bombing of hospitals, schools, and homes, reducing most of the territory to rubble, killing over 37,000 people, with over 13,000 being children, and displacing over 80% of the population, around 1.7 million people. Israel has cut off food to the territory, leading to the risk of famine for more than 1 million people living there. So, here are the questions. Have Palestinians engaged in genocide against Israelis? And have Israelis engaged in genocide against Palestinians? We'll start with this question first. Now, even if the First and Second Intifadas were not sufficiently harmful or directed to the complete erasure of Israel to constitute a genocide, it should be clear that both the attacks by Hamas prior to October 7th, which attempted to deliberately inflict conditions of life that would bring about the destruction of Israel, and the direct attacks on civilians on October 7th should be considered genocide. It is one thing to oppose the idea of an ethno-nationalist state embodied by Zionism in a philosophical sense, but it is definitely another to claim that the response should then be the violent destruction of that state and its people. Even claiming that the response should be to simply remove the people from that place by forced displacement would constitute a genocide. But, looking on the other side, have Israelis engaged in genocide against the Palestinians? The answer, again, is yes. It should be clear that Israelis have also committed genocide against Palestinians. The Nakba alone would be sufficient to show this. Hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes because of the desire to eliminate everyone of that ethnicity from a place. This was intentional. In 1940, Joseph Waits, the head of the Jewish colonization department, stated, "There is no room for both peoples together in this country. The only solution is Palestine without Arabs, and there is no other way but to transfer all of them. Not one village, not one tribe should be left." The intent was clear, the extermination of a people from a place. Later events, such as the actions of Israeli settlers, even without killing, that purposefully displace Palestinians and steal their homes and land, are at least genocide adjacent, if not outrightly genocidal. The current war is a clear example of genocide, especially given the stifling of food aid and the direct attacks by the Israeli government on humanitarian workers. This is consistent with the findings of the UN Human Rights Council, who have found the Israeli government has committed genocide of types 1, 2, and 3 against the Gazan people. On the question of intent, Israeli ministers have called Gazans, quote, human animals, have ordered maximum damage, and have called for bombing without mercy or distinction between civilians and combatants. Netanyahu himself called Gazans the Amalek, who in the Bible God ordered to be destroyed entirely, quote, slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. Overall, there is a reticence in the international community to call the actions of Israel a genocide, despite the clear reality on the ground. These include the fact that the U.S. continues to support Israel and pressures other countries to stand by it. The Israelis have also offered several arguments in their defense. Let's look at them now. First, the right to defend. Israel claims to have the right to defend itself. However, self-defense does not justify genocide. As we've looked at here, the point of genocide being a higher crime than others is that it cannot be justified. War can be waged without starvation, without indiscriminate bombings, and without mass displacement. You can wage a just war according to just war theory, and that is not what Israel is doing. You can defend yourself without killing and displacing millions of civilians. That is not what Israel is doing. And nor is it their intent, as evidenced by the statements of their politicians. Israel has also claimed that this international community is holding it to an unfair standard due to anti-Semitism. And it should be noted that many of the genocides that we discussed above were against Jewish people, as well as many genocides we didn't discuss. And so anti-Semitism does exist, and it exists in many ways on an international scale. However, as noted in the many genocides discussed above, if anything, Israel is being given more leniency, as crimes which displaced fewer people or killed fewer people are still called and considered genocides. And so, while certainly Jewish people are being held to an unfair standard in many situations, and anti-Semitism does exist, in this case, Israel has committed crimes that are worse than others that are being considered genocide. And finally, destruction is the only option. Some Israelis have argued that destruction of Hamas is the only way to stop the cycle of violence or to protect themselves. However, their actions have strengthened, not weakened Hamas. Anyone that cares about the future existence of Israel should want this war to stop as soon as possible. Every child that loses their parents to the indiscriminate bombing of their homes, to the destruction of their hospitals or their school, will grow up to hate Israel. Wars do not end through violence. They end through diplomacy. And every shot that the Israelis murder makes that peace harder. In the end, I'm a skeptic. And I don't know if any of these things constitute genocide, or even if we're working off the right definition. But I am deeply concerned. We can suspend belief, but we cannot suspend action, especially in the face of atrocities. With that, thank you for sticking around with us in the video until the end. If you liked the video, let us know in the comments. If you disagree with the video, let us know in the comments. If we got some of the numbers wrong or some of the ideas wrong, please let us know in the comments below. If you like this longer style of format, it takes a lot of work to put these together, and so they would come out less frequently than our normal videos. But if you would be interested in that trade-off of seeing the channel put together fewer, more complicated, more nuanced videos, let us know in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.